Okay, so let's get going. Mick, thank you so much for taking this on. This is a challenging topic, but I really appreciate because it's great to have the perspective of someone like you who has the competitive experience and also has the education background to address this in a very concrete, realistic way. So take it away, please, Mick.
Yeah, so thank you, Andrea, for the kind introduction, and I'm looking forward to talking about this subject today. Can everybody hear me okay? I hope that's a yes. I guess you're all muted, so you wouldn't be able to respond to that, but hopefully you can all hear me okay. I know the previous session, the last session that was done on this platform was through the with Paul and Kyle, and it was a discussion around debriefs, and I think that topic really connects well to what I'm going to be talking about today. And in fact, today's topic could be the result of a debrief in some cases. So potentially kind of a topic that is relevant at the moment as well, given the time that we are in the season. So before I get started into talking about the topic, I'm just going to share a little bit about myself, just to give you some context. I'm a former player, so I started playing when I was, I think, about 7 years old. I grew up in London, Ontario. Did my undergrad degree there, and I was a competitive junior player. I then moved out to the fine confines of Edmonton, Alberta, where there's still snow on the ground. And I've been here for the last, I believe it's about 10 years. And I've been going to school. I did my master's and my PhD in sports psychology. My supervisor was John Dunn, who actually his name was during the presentation. I think somebody's microphone is on there. And during that time, I was also a competitive player. So I played with Team Botcher during that time. I won't be bringing up any personal examples relating to that experience, but I wanted to mention that I do have a background there. When I moved out here, I also started coaching in the U of A program. I was a U18 development coach. I worked with a number of youth athletes. I also did some mental performance consulting work with various teams and athletes. I'm now currently a performance consultant for Curling Canada, and I'm on the coaching staff for the national wheelchair team. So I've had a fair bit of broad experience, and I think I've sort of dabbled in a lot of different areas. So hopefully I can bring in examples and thoughts and insights from those various experiences today. And also tie in my background a little bit as somebody with a sports psychology background. Today, I'm going to be speaking somewhat anecdotally at times, from the perspective as a coach, from the perspective as an athlete, and from the perspective as a mental performance consultant or a mental trainer. And I think somebody's. Do I have to add them if anybody's coming into the room, or?
Yes, please.
I just called in. I've been trying to get on via video, but it's not. I can't get any audio, so I just called in. But I'm already registered. I see the PowerPoint presentation coming up.
Good. Okay.
So I'm just calling in and just so I can hear. I don't know why my audio is not working, but
okay.
I'm registered 3 times, unfortunately.
Okay. Perfect.
I'll log out of one, and so I'll have the PowerPoint on the video, and then I'll just be on the phone to hear the audio.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I will also bring in a little bit of background from a research perspective, and the hope today is to get some conversation going. You're bound to disagree with something I say along the line. I hope that might be the case. If that is the case, then we're obviously engaging in reflection and thinking about how to approach this subject. I know it's a very sensitive subject, and there's lots of different approaches and ways to consider it. So we're going to hopefully have a chance to reflect and discuss. I also do want to mention that the plan is to kind of bounce ideas a little bit at times off of Andrea and have her pipe in at certain moments during the presentation, maybe ask a question or reinforce things that stand out. So looking forward to the discussion, and we'll jump right in. Hopefully everyone's had a chance to log in to Menti On there, it'll ask you to enter a PIN. When we get to the point in the presentation where that becomes relevant, I will open up my browser and share that with us. I think it's just a prompt for us to start engaging in some discussion. I hope everyone's doing well, and that I know this has been quite a strange time, but I think veiled in this whole circumstance is an opportunity for us to connect in ways like this across different mediums and different platforms. So looking forward to trying out a few things and talking about the subject with everyone. Okay. So most of us may have seen a recent article published by CBC Sports by Devin Hero. What I did is I took a number of different quotes and I haven't attributed them to those who said them, but if you want to find out more about this article, you can read it in CBC Sports. I've shared the link there. But what we see with the subject of team changes is a fair number of different perspectives, and in many cases, those perspectives include some fairly strong words. You talk about, the terms hatred are coming in here, and it's not saying that in this article there is hatred, but certainly there's some. This is an emotionally related subject for sure. And one of the unique things I think we all recognize about our sport is that in many cases, especially at the highest level, the athletes are those who are making the decisions about who's on and who's off of different teams and who's playing together. So that becomes a reality about, as a developing athlete, reality is that at some point we're going to have to face up against these types of circumstances. I don't think I know of a single player who hasn't had a team change somewhere along the line. I apologize if you can hear my dogs barking in the background. I think there's nothing we can do. I might just leave it in this view here. I think just with people coming into the presentation, that's probably easiest. So, okay. Andrew, any reaction here? Any thoughts that you wanted to add?
Yeah, you and I talked about this on Sunday, and how there's a perception, and from me included, that women's teams appear at times to have a harder time with the change in team members than, say, men do. And I know that that's stereotyping, but in the experience that I have, and it doesn't go right across the board, of course, but there has been that perception that it can appear to be more emotional at times for some women's teams than for others, and whether men may feel that same emotion but maybe express it in a different way, I don't know. What are your
Definitely something that we'll get into when we talk about sort of the reaction to and how to maybe move forward when things happen. So certainly, I think they're individual by individual, the reactions to team changes vary, and a lot of it depends on the individual, and I think a lot of it depends on the situation. So sort of right out of the gate, sort of considering both, I think is a fairly important element, both the situation and the person. So moving into the sort of objectives that I wanted to set forth for today. By the end of today's session, hopefully we'll have had a chance to identify, wrestle with, consider some key considerations when it comes to personnel or team changes. Hopefully get an opportunity to apply to our own situations in our own minds, or to the situations that I provided, the hypothetical situations that I provided. And then also maybe get a chance to reflect and start to initiate on our own personal action plan of how we might start to approach this subject in our own experiences. I think it's safe to say probably all of us in this chat have had an experience with a team change somewhere along the line, and we probably all have had a chance to reflect. So hopefully this will allow us to do some more meaningful reflection and consider how we might change or alter or modify or solidify our approach to this subject. When Andrea had asked me to present this topic, I tend to think in songs sometimes, and right away in my head, the song by Lou Bega, Mambo Number 5, just popped into my head. I'm not exactly sure why, but when I started to wrestle with the lyrics, I thought, yeah, this is pretty relevant. So I wanted to give an idea of how complex this notion of team changes really is. I think more than and maybe that's why it's so uncomfortable. That's why it's oftentimes difficult to nail down or to sort out how to approach it.
Are you still there, Mick? Uh-oh.
Hello?
Oh, hi. Okay, you're back.
Where did we lose me?
I don't know. Oh, this might not be good, but let's continue and just see.
Okay.
Some people are having trouble with their audio. So at the top, the bubble on the very left,
Yes.
if that looks like a microphone. Oh, we've lost you again. Oh no.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So at what point did the audio cut out? At what point could you no longer hear me?
Just when I said the bubble at the top on the very left.
Okay, so in talking about this slide here, we've been able to hear me so far?
Yes, we got to Mambo number 5, but we didn't hear any of the connection between Mambo number 5 and the Bingo Dabbers.
Okay, well, hopefully we can get back into it here. So,
Yeah.
my initial reaction when I heard about doing this presentation, for whatever reason, this song popped into my head, and started to think about how the lyrics kind of reflect the number of variables that we can consider when it comes to making team changes and how complex the situation can be. So with the up and down arrows, what I'm trying to communicate there is this idea that team changes can be driven by a coach in situations where a coach is making a selection for a team or deselecting players, but it can also, and probably more often in our sport, be driven by players. The next piece here, the move it all around, this is meant to reflect that team changes can involve any number of different players, from all 4 to just 1. So we have so many different iterations, so many different examples of how teams can change in that regard. Then we have 1 step left and 1 step right. So you might be leaving a team, or you might be asked to leave a team, or you might be joining a team or asked to join a team. So there's so many different considerations to take place there. And then lastly, when you are going through a team change, you also have this idea of potential positional changes. So not only do you have a team change playing with a new player, but you might also have a situation where you're moving into a different position when that change happens. So I think I was saying before, and maybe the audio cut out, but there is no manual, I don't think, for team changes in curling. We have a series of variables to consider. So in the end of the day, I think if it looks like this idea of, if it looks like we're reflecting on it and thinking about it, we're probably doing something right. If we're wrestling with this idea of how to communicate it and how to approach the subject, that's a really smart first step. Are we able to hear me still?
Yep, it's all good. I've got my chat box open, Mick, so if we can't hear you, I'll send you a quick chat.
Great. Okay, and then we also have this idea of, this type of selection, deselection, reselection onto teams and away from teams can vary largely based on where we might be operating on the long-term athlete development model. So, between recreational, competitive, and high performance, there's all kinds of considerations to consider along different age groups. I know from what I've heard in the chat here, most of us are U18, U21 coaches, but I think these things apply straight through from even younger ages to even older ages. Obviously, there'll be some different considerations to think about along those different avenues. So in looking at some of the research out there on team changes and specifically looking at deselection, and I know we're going to talk about more than deselection. In fact, on the previous slide, I had the notion of this idea of reselection, because in curling we can be deselected, but we can also reselect ourselves onto different teams or with different players. But the impacts, I think, are fairly far and wide. One thing I do want to note as an overarching thought is that team changes really do reflect a shared stressor. So it's something that impacts not just the players that are involved, but also parents, coaches, potentially family members. It's not simply impacting one individual when it does take place. Sport, and specifically I think in our context, curling is a big part of our lives, and so when something as significant as changing who we are playing with happens, it is often felt by not just the person who's leaving a team or being asked to leave. We also have some often fairly significant social consequences. So in some ways, it might affect your perceived social standing. Maybe, if you're on one of the top teams and you are deselected off of that top team, there may be some social consequences. But I think more to my note on this one, it's the potential loss of close friends, at least spending time around them. Right? We spend so much time around our teammates and coaches and the parents within the context of our sport that as soon as that is withdrawn from us in some way, or we withdraw from that, there are social consequences, just a loss of contact with people in many cases. It doesn't always happen, but certainly is something to consider. We also have financial consequences. So we have potential sponsorship on the line. In some cases, families or individuals might have a difficult time affording to be able to both curl and work, or being able to support their youth athletes if they're playing in a lot of tournaments and traveling a lot. So the financial piece is a big element as well. Athletic identity is another one that I wanted to mention. So in any pursuit where we devote our time, we often tend to start defining ourselves in some way, as a parent, as a kid, as a family member, but oftentimes athlete is one of the first things that if you were to ask somebody how they define themselves, it's probably one of the first things that comes up. So this element of athlete identity being forefronted in my perspective is something to consider as well. We often will base our self-worth off of our our performance or how we're perceived in the context of sport, and so when something like being deselected happens, it can take that away from us, or it can jeopardize that in some way. So definitely something to along with that is the emotional distress that can be the result of either deselecting a player or being deselected, right? So when I think about somebody, when you're making a decision to make a change on your team, it can come with guilt, shame, relief, anxiety, happiness, sadness. And when you're being deselected, basically probably all the same emotions and more: hurt, anger, dejection, sadness. Anytime we have a really valued goal and that valued goal is put into jeopardy in some way, it tends to come along with a lot of emotional distress, potentially. Along with that, or potentially as a result of that, we also have spillover into other elements of our lives. So we might see spillover into other parts like school, work, our relationships with people in our life, our family members, potentially even other sports. And research actually shows that players who are deselected are actually at a higher risk. I'm not saying that they're going to, but they're at a higher risk for developing clinical levels of psychological distress. So definitely an important subject to discuss, and I think one that we often tend to avoid. So I've just rambled on there for a bit on these different elements. Andrea, any reflections there? Anything that you wanted to maybe touch on or reiterate?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because all of those are huge impacts, depending, of course, on the situation and the person. But sometimes it's the financial consequences that we see as having a bigger impact, perhaps, or it adds insult to injury, kind of a thing. Do you think that's might be somebody's experience?
Yeah, I certainly could sort of, the financial consequences could come along with an additional meaning behind them. It's not just that I'm losing that money or that money's not available to me anymore, but it's that money's indicative of the fact that I'm no longer on this team or I'm asked to leave this team or what have you. So
Right.
certainly could be the case for sure.
Yeah, yeah. And parents, you get parents in the mix, not so much with the financial consequences. Well, and that too, but just their child's identity in their view.
Yeah.
Right? What the impact on their child.
Yeah, the spillover that it's a shared stressor that parents are likely to experience the emotional distress along with their kids in many cases. I think we all like to think that we plan on handling it well and we're going to handle it well and we have handled it well, but nonetheless, I think there's that is the case that deselection comes with it a number of things to consider, a number of potential impacts. I'm not saying that each of these apply in each situation, but they're all possible, and that's why I think it's an important topic to discuss.
Hi, Mick. There was Paul Webster in his effective season debriefing seminar. He said it's better to stick with the current team and work out your differences than deselecting a team member. What's your thoughts on that?
It's such a contextual, situation-specific decision. Obviously, if you think there's room to grow and you think there's an opportunity to improve, I think on that side of the coin, then that would be my first inkling or my first suggestion would be to try to, dig in and figure out a way. But we live in the reality of competitive sport where performance matters and doing your best to maximize your performance, whether it means making a player change or making some changes in the positions of your teammates currently, or just making adjustments as a group. I think in all cases, decisions have to be made, and developing a process for that and going through it and making that part of your debrief, is an important element. So I don't know that I think I'm probably dodging your answer, maybe being a little politically correct there, but especially with youth, I think it's probably better to stick with it and try to figure it out. Rather than potentially running away from concern or an issue, facing it head on at first before making a decision to avoid it or move on. So does that answer your question?
Yes, that's perfect. Thanks.
Any other comments or thoughts on this before we move on? I think this is kind of the heavy piece here. So okay. So moving on to sort of I guess the meat and potatoes of today's presentation. When I was first working through this presentation, I thought of some different ways to try to communicate. And my initial mindset was to create some sort of a decision tree. But as I started to consider all the different variables at play, it just didn't seem to make sense to me. And so the way I've kind of conceptualized this in my head, and the way I'm trying to communicate it in some ways, is I almost work through a checklist of different considerations when it comes to team changes. So for the most of this next little bit here, we're going to operate under the assumption that the decision is either imminent or has been made to make a player change or to leave a team. And that this is kind of the nuts and bolts of how we might work through that process. I've reordered, so we typically go who, what, when, where, why, and how. I've reordered these things in the order that I think they come up within the context of this specific subject. So I'm going to share some insights across each of these different sort of dimensions, and my list is by no means exhaustive, but I think I'm trying to touch on some key considerations, and I look forward to any input from the audience or the group that's listening in.
Okay, Mick, I think are you there? I can I can see your cursor moving. I'm very sorry, everyone. We worked on this on Monday for over an hour, and we didn't have this problem. So I don't know what it is tonight. Several people have tried to get on and can view the video, the visual, but they're not able to get audio and end up having to phone in. That's what I'm wondering, Mick, if maybe you're going to have to phone in. Use your phone. I'll send a number. Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, I have that phone number available, so if this happens again, I will dial that number and try to join from there.
We've got quite a bit of feedback now.
I don't know what to say. If you turn your microphone off, you want to try that?
Or you turn. So you're on the computer right now?
Yeah.
Okay. Hang on.
If you try turning your microphone off now. I can't turn mine off.
No, we still have feedback. So I think what you might have to do is mute your computer and use the phone.
Okay.
I'm very sorry.
I will do so.
So Mick is going to mute his computer and phone in. I don't know why we've got feedback now.
If you can hear me, I'm trying to join with the PIN number here. So. Can anybody hear me?
Yeah, and we still have feedback. Well, I'll mute myself.
Hello? Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, there's some feedback. I'm going to mute everyone and see if that helps.
Okay.
Okay, Mick, if you can hear me, can you say something, please? Let's go this way. Wait. Okay, I'm going to reclaim the presenter role. Okay, and now I'm going to pass the presenter role to Mick. Mick, you'll have to accept it again. Okay, can you try talking now, Mick? Are you still muted on? Because you're on the phone. Try opening up your mic again on the presentation.
Hello?
And yes, there is no feedback now.
Okay, so I can hear you through the phone, but I can't hear you on my screen. So I've just turned my volume down. So I'll keep my phone open.
Okay.
And talk. Whatever we've got going on right now is working. So
yes. So let's just go with that. I'm very sorry, everyone. We haven't had this problem in any other webinar that we've had recently. So go ahead.
It's probably something I've done today. So I'll take the blame.
Okay.
So I think where we left off potentially last time was a discussion about the different potential factors to consider when it comes to when I first thought about the subject, I worked in my head, I thought about a decision tree, but I think in the end of the day, sort of working through a checklist is maybe the most appropriate way to think about this. And certainly there's going to be insights that I might share that you may not agree with. And I'm looking forward to hearing what others have to say and others' thoughts on the subject. Are we okay still for being able to hear me?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. So I did reorder these a little bit throughout the presentation in the order that I think they kind of come up when it comes to making this type of decision, going through the deselection process. And so I'll just sort of jump right in and talk about the first set of sort of variables or considerations. So I think when we're looking into making a change on a team, the first thing that we were going to want to consider is the why. Why is a team deciding to make a change, or why is a player deciding to make a change? And this process, I think, actually starts before we even consider making a change. It starts at the beginning of a season. It starts at the formation of a team. Teams who have clear and shared expectations and goals have a much easier time, I think, coming back around to those things and addressing them and deciding whether or not a personnel change is an appropriate decision or appropriate course of action. So having some clear expectations as far as commitment levels, time being spent, but also having a number of different goals, and those can be outcome goals. So how we're looking to perform in the short and long term. They can be performance goals. So we want to make sure that we're improving, or we want to improve on these elements of our game over this course of time. Or they can be process goals. What are the mechanisms that our team is going to have in place to succeed at our goals? And if players or a team member isn't necessarily sort of following through on those different elements, that might be one consideration for why we might decide to make a team change. This is a tricky one, but this idea of initial recognition that the ending is inevitable on a team. It is kind of the elephant in the room. I think we all recognize that change in curling is inevitable, that it's going to happen at some point in one's career. I challenge us all to think of a player who hasn't at least had one player come or go off of their team, if not multiple times. So finding a way to communicate this in a positive manner, I think, is an important one. So, we're committing to the year, or, we're going to give this a 2-year run. And I think some sort of recognition that the ending is inevitable helps enable the process when it does take place. That might also take place at a personal level. So just sort of recognizing that, hey, this is a part of the sport, and one that most people may not enjoy, but it is part of the sport, and something that we're going to have to consider at some point. I'm going to stop there and just sort of make sure that you're able to hear me still, and maybe bounce any ideas off of Andrea here.
Yeah, no, that's great. I can open up the mics and just see if there's any questions. I'll unmute everyone, see if there's any questions, comments, and then we'll mute everybody again. So any questions or comments? Nobody wants to talk because they'll be heard twice.
I'm assuming that you are going to have the initial recognition in the form of a team contract.
I wouldn't necessarily say that needs to be the case. I've witnessed the team contract go very much awry in some cases, and in other cases, it's not something that's been necessary. If a contract is used, I would encourage that contract to be a very much player-driven element, and one that the team collectively decides on, rather than something that's put or placed in front of a team. Obviously, if you're part of a program where it's a very coach-driven program, that might not be the case. But when a team is formed together, it doesn't necessarily have to be a contract per se, but maybe a potential. What do we stand for? What are the things that we want to do this season? It can be sort of more of a priority action item type of exercise rather than a contract.
Okay, hang on.
Yeah.
Okay, can you talk, please, Mick?
Yep.
Okay, we're back. All right. So I think because of the audio trouble that we're having, would everybody please use the chat box for now, and then we will try opening up the mics again at the end of the session. Dick Henderson has a comment, Mick. I like the concept of recognizing that the end of the team is a reality.
Yeah, I think it's one that it's inevitable, right? Like, we're going to miss in curling. There's things that are going to happen, and a team adjourning, not being together in some way, shape, or form at some point is a definite reality. So, obviously not a thing that we want to, slap down on the table and say, hey, like we're only going to be together for X number of years, but rather just an understanding. And then, I think I spoke to that element of, doesn't necessarily have to be a team contract between these first 2 points, but more just a sort of a sense of agreement, a sense of shared and common goals and expectations that we're going to place on ourselves as opposed to that are placed on us. Another element that I think is important here, and one that precedes making the decision, is facing issues and concerns head on during the season. Nothing worse than not saying anything and hoping something's going to go away, and then it starts to build and grow and grow. And by the end of the season, we can no longer tolerate it, and the only course of action we feel we can make is making a change. So the first kind of course of action is that in many ways probably trying to prevent making a change in the first place by facing issues and concerns head on. It also enables us to kind of justify or make the decision if we do end up making the decision. We faced these concerns, we didn't see a change, or we didn't improve, or things didn't get better. So I think it's time to move on. That can be a helpful way to work through that. And then lastly, identify your reasons when you do come to making a decision. I don't think we just lost that last game is a great reason, but I would urge whomever's making the change to at least write down a list of a couple of reasons why they think it's the right move to make, or why that might happen. So why? Big element, and one that I think we set up for ourselves even way in advance of making the decision. It's really hard to justify making team changes if we if we haven't done the groundwork that led up to them. So I'm just going to keep an eye on the chat here.
Yep, I will too, Mick.
Any thoughts before we move into the next piece?
No, I think that's great. Thank you.
I think we're doing okay for time.
Yes.
But I'll jump into the next one here. So the next consideration is who is making the decision and communicating it. And I think those two things probably should go hand in hand. And that's my first point here, is take ownership. It's very much a reality of our sport at the adult level that players make these decisions and are very much involved in them. And so taking ownership at a younger age, I think, is a really big piece of this. So it might be uncomfortable, it might not be something that younger athletes want to be involved with, but if it's a player-driven team, or if it's a team where the players have decided to play together and they want to move on, then I think they need to be involved in that conversation. It doesn't need to be just them, but they should be a part of that conversation. From a developmental perspective, that's only going to do good things, I think, for the athlete if it's handled in the right way. That kind of leads into or ties into the second point, which is the coach or player. So from my perspective and my experience, if the coach is selecting the team, it should probably be the coach leading that discussion. If it's a player or if the players have selected the team, then the players probably should be the ones who are kind of leading that discussion. Of course, depending on the age, coach could be involved in that discussion, but we want to make sure that we're very careful about how we're either facilitating that or being involved with that. So I think this is where I'd probably ask the group sort of more generally what experiences have been. So if you have any thoughts or insights as to how you've been involved, whether it's been as a fly on the wall when these discussions are had, or as somebody to bounce ideas off of. But nonetheless, that taking ownership piece, I think, ties in there as well. I'll keep moving on, but if anybody has a thought there, I'd invite to add it to the chat.
It's interesting because I was involved in a situation, not so much as a coach, but at a curling camp where a team was having difficulty with one player who, for several seasons, was paying lip service to, she would always say, yes, I'm going to be out there for practice. And she would be for the first part of the season. But then halfway through the season, her interest waned and she developed other priorities. And it was a very tough conversation for the team to come to the realization that if they wanted to move forward, there was only one way that they could do it. And it wasn't, I would have liked it to have been more pleasant.
So
and I could have.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that exactly. You hope that there won't be hurt feelings, that there won't be emotion involved. And I probably could have handled it better, but there was no do-over that time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I would hope in that instance, and maybe this leads into our next point, that when three players made that decision, that it, at least if it didn't happen that time, that, in subsequent situations where this has come up, we avoid this idea of teaming up. So it doesn't necessarily set up for a very sort of comfortable environment if it's sort of three players deciding that one is not going to be with them anymore. That they do that 3-on-1. I would urge those conversations to take place at a 1-on-1 level. In fact, I think in any direction, those conversations are most appropriate at a 1-on-1 level. Now, of course, those conversations could be, supervised or facilitated by a coach, but I do think that we want to avoid a 2-on-1 or a 3-on-1 situation. The one exception from this perspective for me is where you have an individual who has decided to leave a team. If you decide that you want to talk to all three at once, that's your prerogative, and if you feel comfortable doing so, then that's probably the one exception. But avoiding teaming up, I think, sets up for a safer, more comfortable discussion. And I think we're likely going to see emotions regardless of what happens. We want to make sure that those emotions are experienced in a comfortable manner. as opposed to feeling like you're being overwhelmed or teamed up.
Or cornered, like it's essentially cornered. And as I recall, we it was one other player and I, and it was just really, it was a very tough situation. It was hard to know what the best approach was. We have a couple of comments. The process of forming a team is of the utmost importance. It lays the groundwork for all future development. And I think you talked about that earlier, Mick, as well, about agreements or, everybody being on the same page. We do have a question. If you know a player is very emotional, is it better to deselect the player without giving them any reason?
I would tend to agree with the idea that we probably still need to give a reason. I think that kind of comes later in the presentation when talking about reasons, but I do think the reason can be one that's not specific and overly exhaustive, but providing a reason or providing a few reasons. And they can be more, alluding to the future and we think this might give us a better opportunity, or we're ready for a change, or a reason can be varied in its specificity and its directedness. But reasons nonetheless, the honesty of going through that process, I think, is important. It helps people grow who are going through that. So, to answer that question, I that's how I would view that. But that's to each their own, I think, too. So.
There's another comment here. When this person was 16, this person told their dad, coach, that the team wanted to ask one of our players to leave the team. He told me if it was the team's decision that I, the skip, had to be the one to deliver the message face to face. It was one of the best lessons I ever learned. So that's
Absolutely.
Interesting. Yeah.
So when we think of sport as a microcosm of life, and there's different elements of relationships, and curling teams are there's relationships involved in curling teams.
Mm-hmm.
So learning to change and modify your involvement in those relationships, however they might be, and even if it's just off and on ice relationship that changes, I think it's a great lesson to learn, and one that comes back to that idea of ownership. So I think we're hearing an echo now of some of the thoughts earlier on in the slide here that are coming up. So
Julie, could you just give us a quick chat about what you learned? Just enter it into the chat box.
And then I will continue on with the slide if that's okay.
Yes, please. Yep.
Okay. And then the last one here, and this is probably for me the most sensitive one on the slides. They're all important, and that's why, well, at least from my perspective, they're all important. But the last one here is this notion of parental involvement. So parents love their kids, and parents and or guardians love their kids and are there for them to support them in most cases. And so when a decision like this happens, the temptation, I think, is often for parents to help and be there and speak for, in some cases, their kid, and we want to be really careful about how parents are involved, and of course parent coaches are not uncommon, and I think I would venture to guess that at least half of the participants in this conversation are parent coaches, and being able to try to do our best to bracket out ourselves as a parent for that moment, and be ready to be a parent to support the reaction to the decision, I think is the suggestion I have here. So when we enter into that context as a parent coach, that's something that we have to be considering and be preparing for, because the eventuality of a team no longer playing together is more likely than not, and so figuring out how you're going to position yourself in that role is, I think, a super important one to reflect on in advance of that decision being made. That's probably a very heavily laden one. I'm not a parent too, so I think I'm not an expert to speak to that. But my experiences with parents have shown that parents truly care, are truly there for the best interests of the athletes, and can be really instrumental in helping with the coping following a deselection or a reselection. So parental involvement is super important, but in most cases, I think the communication of the decision shouldn't fall on their shoulders. Reaction to that at all, Andrea?
No, I having been a coach and of younger players, and the parental involvement is absolutely huge. It's you have to consider that the parents are a part of the team, because they are. Their influence over the kids and over situations is tremendous, and I agree. Everybody has the best interests of the children at heart. So if you can't, if you, somehow you need to turn the parental involvement into a positive, and not get them on your side, but make the best use of the resources that they're offering.
Yeah, and we see a comment here from, I think it's Sabina. The parent of the deselected player can often take it harder than the athlete themselves and lash out. And again, I think that has a lot to do with sort of the care that a parent has for an athlete and the investment that they have in their kid's success or what have you. So in many ways, I think investing in that consideration, discussing that with parents at some way along the line is something that a coach might consider investing in. It's, you don't want to start talking about the end of a team before it even starts, but certainly something to consider, or something to work in and think about. Okay, I'm going to jump into the next topic here, just in the interest of time. And so that's the next piece, is what is said. So what are we saying when it comes time to actually communicate the decision? So we've worked through the why, we've decided who was going to communicate that. Now, what is going to be said in that moment? So a couple thoughts here. First, I would always provide reasons if you're the one making the decision. And if you are the one sort of receiving the decision, I would spend some time considering the reasons, and considering some reasons that may not have been spoken about, but consider them nonetheless. So the reason doesn't have to be super specific, and it doesn't have to be performance related. It can be, I just don't think we were having as much fun as we used to have, or I just think it's time for a change, or I really want to just try a new position out, or we really want to, we really think this is a good opportunity to play with a player that we met at camp and we were just really connected, and I just that's what I'm thinking I want to do, or what we want to do. So the reasons don't have to be super specific, but I think a reason being provided is an important element. From my experience and my observations, being concise is important. I tend to be a fairly verbose individual myself. I say a lot, and sometimes don't say very much, as you probably found out during this presentation. So on that note, trying to be concise, and this might involve writing down a list of a few things that you want to say, or even writing it out before you say it. The next element here on the list is respect for dignity, and that's just being aware of the impact that this decision might have on yourself and on the teammate that you're making the decision with. So having care for how they're going to react, and communicating in a way that is not going to be directed to them as a person. So finding a way to try to separate, if performance is a reason, trying to separate out performance from the person, and if it's something else, just doing our best not to make it really about me versus you and us versus them. Creating that sort of dichotomy or binary doesn't tend to help situations, doesn't build bridges. It tends to create islands. So just being respectful of how that's communicated, obviously keeping your voice calm and just speaking sort of directly, I think, is a big piece there. And then for both communicator and receiver of the information, trying to find the good, and I use the phrase mine for the upside. So sometimes we have to dig through the dirt to find something shiny. So in this case, look for the good in things. So we talk about teams adjourning. It doesn't have to be a bad thing. It can be a celebration. It can be an exciting moment for everyone. Or something that we can celebrate. Hey, we had a really good run together. We did this, and this, and geez, I really enjoyed playing with you, but I just think it's time for something new. So really re-emphasizing the positive element, I think, is important. And in many ways, if you want to start and end that discussion with the positives, probably helps as well. So I've just rambled here. Andrea, insights, thoughts, and maybe I can look to some questions on the chat.
Yeah, I think I agree. When we talked on Monday, I think the celebration part is important when you can. You know, the team has come to an end, whether it's one person leaving the team or the whole team breaking up. Is there a way to celebrate it? I had a question from a coach recently about a team that had the potential to do very well in their last year of U21, and they didn't achieve the success that they were capable of, and they were moving on to women's, and with that they felt like they needed a change. So it wasn't a negative change that was happening. Everybody was viewing it as a positive, but the coach was wondering how to make it as positive as possible. And so then that's when we talked about, was there a way to celebrate? So did you see the question that came up? Should the person
with the U18 team? So obviously, when we're communicating this, we want to be mindful if it's a two U18 players discussing with one another. That's one thing. And if it's an adult speaking to a kid, then we want to be very, very mindful of the rule of two. But when it comes to two youth discussing and making this decision, I would urge parents to be within earshot, to be there to help react to the situation, but to do their best not to get too involved in the communication. So I do think it would be beneficial for the player themselves to speak and talk. But when it comes to the parents' involvement, obviously each situation is different and each individual is different. But that would be my initial reaction, is that if the athletes are making the decision, that they communicate it with one another, and that parents be close by to support and help out, but do their best to not get involved.
That's something that could be established at the beginning of the season as well, is kind of a script, or where parents will be involved and what the expectations are of them, with, of course, with their input. And you raised a really good point earlier too about putting things down in writing, almost like having a script for yourself when you're in this situation to present to the deselected player, so that you stick to the script, and that way you can be as concise as possible, and your reasons, you'll have had time to think about them. And
yeah, and oftentimes somebody who's communicating this type of thing might be fairly nervous about it or anxious about communicating it in the first place. Mm-hmm. So being prepared and writing these things down might help to guide your talking points when you go to have that communication, because otherwise you might start rambling on or saying things that you hadn't prepared to say, or that you maybe didn't want to say or didn't intend to say, but just kind of came out. So definitely spending the time in advance of making that communication and working through how you're going to do it is an important piece.
Great.
So the first mentee thing I think has come up here. So I've arranged this so that these first three elements are kind of relevant to our first scenario. So I was going to just share this mentee presentation, and if on your device you want to respond to the question, so what you do is on mentee.com, you'll use the code 852948 on your secondary device. And what I'm asking us to do is select the key considerations from today's presentation that apply to this first situation. So I'll leave that in the background for now, and then I'll just kind of leave the presentation up. So 852948, I'll enter that into the chat. And hopefully that's working. I don't see anybody responding yet.
So people may be just reviewing the scenarios that were sent out.
So I'll bring that back over. Scenario 1. Sorry. And if the Menti doesn't work, then we can always just enter some thoughts into the chat and discuss there as well. So obviously we have a couple of variables to consider here. There's a parent coach and potentially a bit of a reluctant parent coach. I know of several teams that I've been involved with in some way, shape, or form that have had a parent coach who has stepped forward to help out when there wasn't a coach that wasn't a parent available. We also see here a couple other elements about sort of decisions that were made at the start of the year. And the age of the athletes is communicated as well. So basically what I've asked for is for us to respond to what elements of this situation are relevant to the list of discussion points that we had previously. So hopefully the Menti is coming through there. Okay, so we have a number of responses, and maybe it's a good time to start sort of exploring them and discussing them. So the first one here, we have a note on why clear and shared goals. Does anybody want to sort of unmute and step forward and discuss that, or maybe enter some thoughts into the chat? Certainly, I think there's probably a passage back earlier on in the here that, or in the scenario, where the team talks about they didn't necessarily set a team practice, but let's try to practice once a week. So there's an element of that there has been some discussion, but perhaps do we think it's not specific enough? What are some reflections there on this one?
We had some.
Anything you wanted to share? Or?
Well, I was just going to say we had earlier today. Some people did let me know that the email was jumbled for them, so I did resend the scenarios in a different format. And somebody just let me know now that unfortunately that it was it was jumbled when they got it. So
Sabina, I see a comment here. The athlete missed the extra practice that were not scheduled. Is the onus in this situation on the athlete who missed these practices, or is it potentially a lack of clarity from the team as far as what their expectations were to start the year, and maybe those weren't communicated throughout the year? Yeah, I agreed, Sabina. So Sabina said here, so teammates are making a decision based on a lack of commitment. And that decision maybe not that well founded in this situation because there wasn't clarity for the athlete who they're thinking about deselecting. So yeah, the onus is on the collective team to come together and make that decision. Obviously, if the team wants to practice more and put together more of a devoted practice schedule, then that's something that might lead to a player deselecting themselves. So maybe that makes it a little more comfortable. Dick says here that the team was destined for destruction from the start. Potentially, you were destined for difficulty from the start, and finding a way to be a little more clear about this moving forward would be, I think, a helpful step forward. So potentially the ending being inevitable could have been communicated as well. We had one response there. Why? We need to face some issues during or earlier on in the season. So what are some thoughts there? is that can potentially connect to the earlier discussion about, being clear about what our commitment is and facing that issue at the point where we started to add extra practices, as opposed to not confronting that situation earlier on in the year? Is that where we see that happening? We also have a Y here for identify reasons. So does anybody want to pipe in there? I would urge you to communicate in some way on the chat if you have access to it, so we can kind of interact in some way here.
I'm kind of wondering if people that are on the phone are sure that they mute their computer, if we might not have a clearer. Okay. We could try it again.
So what I will do then for now is just kind of bounce off, draw connections between them potentially.
Yeah. Okay. So we're going to try it. I'm going to try to unmute everybody. If everybody who is on the phone makes sure that their computer is muted, hopefully we'll be okay.
Hello, everyone.
Oh no, we've got feedback. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to mute everybody again. So I'm sorry, folks. We haven't run into this for a very long time.
Hey, we'll just make the most of it. We're facing our issues head on, and we'll just work our way through it here. So. Okay. So a couple other thoughts here. This idea of taking ownership is forefronted. So I would tend to agree that in this case, the athletes have tried to defer the responsibility of the decision and communication to the reluctant coach, who's also a parent coach, which complicates things a little bit even more. So, hello?
Oh yeah, you're still there.
And so this idea of the players taking ownership in this moment, I think they're at the age where they are more than competent to being able to do that, should they make the decision in the first place. So the who, coach or player, definitely in this situation, I would suggest that the player or players should be involved in the discussion rather than the coach directly being the person making the decision. We definitely want to avoid teaming up here if we do decide to join the team or deselect a player. So one-on-one conversations with a parent close by would probably be the suggested course of action. We also have parental involvement being an important consideration. So this is a parent coach. How does that look? And I think we've already kind of discussed that a little bit. Yeah, and we have a comment here from Len about, missing weekend practices led to only one win at provincials. So it might have been something else that not necessarily one player's lack of commitment. So I think being honest and reflecting on performance is important, which I think connects a lot in this situation to the win. So my first response when I put this scenario together was that we should be waiting a little bit later. But I actually think I haven't covered the win yet, so I have to apologize for that. I'm not sure why that's taken place. This was meant to be covered before this scenario, so maybe this is a good time to jump into the when, and then we can come back to the scenario. So my apologies. The next item here is, when do you decide and act? So my thoughts or suggestions or considerations here is that oftentimes earlier is better. So if you have made the decision, doing so earlier is best for all involved, because it gives those a chance who maybe have been deselected to find a new team, and it gives your team a chance to reform and start moving forward. So if the decision is made, there's not a ton of sense in delaying it. But that being said, jumping to the last point on this slide, probably making the decision right after a loss or during the event still is not going to be helpful. Emotions are likely to be running high, and so waiting at least 24 hours and getting a chance to really reflect on things, it's a fairly significant decision. So making it in that moment, letting emotions drive the ship is probably not going to be helpful. We do want to use emotion to help us make decisions, but we want it to be a member of the crew, not the captain of the ship. And then the other consideration here is, do we do this post playdowns or we do it postseason? So in some cases, you have a players' championship that is the final event of the season, and despite the playdowns being the sort of peak for most players' seasons, they might have events going on after it. So this is more of a consideration of when is it appropriate, when did the team agree, was there sort of, you know, what they were working towards, and is it a comfortable decision to be able to make a change before the end of the year to give everybody a chance to find new teams. So my apologies, I jumped ahead of myself there and didn't orient my slides in the right order once I reordered them here. So coming back to the scenario and the mentee responses here, I think this speaks to this idea of once the dust settles, probably appropriate in this scenario to wait a little bit longer. And where during the season are we going to do this important consideration? But once the decision's made, I would agree, earlier the better probably. So any insights or thoughts, Andrea, or everybody else?
No, I think you've covered it. I agree, the earlier the better. And having it in writing ahead of time is also very helpful.
So, sorry, having it in writing relating to?
Like having, well, maybe not in writing, but having an agreement when the team forms. How long is the relationship, and you know, what are the expectations? I worked with a very high performance team one summer who made a significant team member change, and we met during the summer out at their cottage and talked about it and went through a script, and they had specific expectations, and the player that was coming onto the team was aware of those expectations, and there were performance standards as well, and this was very high performance, and there was a time limit set, and if she didn't achieve those expectations, she was aware that the relationship, she could be deselected if there wasn't the performance that was required.
So having a sense of the time frame and what that might look like is an important consideration to bring into the fold. Greg Elliott here has a comment about making it to provincials an achievement of itself. Most certainly, you know, putting together a team and competing and advancing forward is definitely an achievement. But in this case, I think the achievement for the team fell short of their valued goal potentially. So how are they going to respond to that in this moment, right? I think it varies based on where the team's goals were in the first place. So that speaks back to setting clear and shared goals at the start of the year. If it was an achievement, certainly it's an achievement, but if it was the achievement they were going for, then it might make it a little more difficult to adjourn the team in this situation. Sabina here says, reality is teams who don't make the Provs start reforming earlier, and those who are at Provs do it soon afterwards, so sometimes waiting until the dust settles doesn't happen in U18 and U20. So Sabina, I think this is a relative statement here. After the dust settles, the conversations might be taking place, you know, as the event comes to a close, but the actual decision and, you know, acting upon that decision, I would suggest wait for a moment, unless it was one that was sort of already being made. So this idea of just allowing emotions to subside, even if it's 24 hours, is something to think about. So certainly important to time sensitive. Earlier is the better, but that's with the caveat of after the dust settles in some cases. So I'm going to move on to the next topic of conversation because I want to make sure we're sticking with time. So the next element here is where do you communicate? What platform do you use? So some brief insights here. I would always choose. Is there feedback on your end, Andrea?
No, I'm good.
I would always choose or urge players to do what makes the deselected player the most comfortable. So if you're doing the deselecting, if it's going to make you uncomfortable, but it's going to make the other person far more comfortable to go through that in person, then maybe that's the right choice. Typically, I would suggest that over the phone is a fairly safe bet because you both have a bit of an escape hatch. If somebody is really upset and doesn't want to continue talking, they can simply say, I think I need to just have some time and maybe we can talk a bit later. But on the phone is always an option. And I would urge, unless there's mitigating circumstances, over email is probably last resort. So obviously, if players are really far away from each other or there's no phone reception, that's another thing. But I've definitely encouraged the practice of writing the email, but not sending it, using it as a tool for how would I want to communicate this, but then doing that over the phone or in person. And then lastly, I think the most important consideration here is keeping in mind the rule of two when this is being communicated. So where is it being done? Well, we want to make sure that we're not, isolating a youth with an adult when the decision is being communicated, because that is very much, I think it's against law at this point. So we want to make sure that we're being very careful with that. And during emotional conversations, we might lose sight of or forget about those cues. So being mindful of that and having that be at front of mind probably should be the first thing on this slide, a definite important consideration.
We have some comments.
Yes.
Would the teams at Provs consider the reality before they go to provincials? And the response was there seems to be a lot of movement with teams now, unfortunately, so it's hard as a coach to work with the team over time to improve. Very true. Another comment, it's tough on the player they are getting rid of right after a poor playdown, but they don't want to lose their new player. So if they, yeah, exactly. Should we incorporate?
That speaks to the landscape that we're seeing in the high performance level of our sport, and that kind of often gets modeled by younger athletes, right? We see players changing, and there's a significant amount of money on the line and opportunities to go to the Olympics, and players are not too hesitant, or not as hesitant maybe as they were in the past to act. And so in this case, we might be seeing a little bit of an echo, a cultural echo here amongst our younger teams. So I think that speaks back to Paul's recommendation of, has the first thing been considered of working through the concerns and issues before we get to making that team change?
Another comment, should we incorporate the hockey model and have tryouts for the team that one will coach? If you have the luxury maybe of a pool to draw from, but yeah, it's hard.
Yeah, I mean, I've been privy to both models, right? So being somebody who grew up in Ontario and playing with varied teammates, we put teams together, and that's how it was done with players. And then moving out west, being a part of a university program where the development model is very much more coach-driven, players were selected to teams. Players were still involved to some degree in that selection, but it's very much a coach-driven selection process. And that is probably the exception more than it is the norm in most places, I think. And it comes with its own set of circumstances to consider. I coach now, I'm one of the coaches of the national wheelchair team, and that's also a selected team. Internationally, we see a lot of teams being selected by the coach or by some sort of panel or some group of coaches or integrated support team. So each model has its merits, and I think we're in a situation where we're seeing more of the coach-driven selection taking place. But in many cases, when you only have a certain number of players available in a certain area, it almost becomes a matter of just playing with who's nearby.
Yep. Yeah. Another comment, I believe that the reality is in most cases, next year's teams are often set before provincials have even started. That is interesting. So changes are happening before the provincials are even taking place.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to this whole game within the game, and
Yes.
potentially the discussions have been had, and there's been a verbal kind of, yeah, I think that's what we're going to do. But I would hope that the final decision isn't made or communicated unless it's appropriate to do so until after the season is over, or after the event that you've kind of decided is probably the place where those changes are made.
Another comment, after seeing universities and colleges using that model, I think that it can have more of its own challenges, and that's true too.
Most certainly, and whoever is at the helm of making the decisions, I think if they're not really carefully considering some of the things we've talked about today, it can be a challenge in and of itself. Just the reality of the size of the teams in our sport and the way teams form and change so often. Again, we're seeing this again. This is the reality of how this works.
Okay.
Moving into the next one.
Yeah.
Okay. So my final sort of set of considerations here is the element of how do you move on once a decision is communicated. So a couple of sort of important thoughts or considerations here. The first, I think the initial reaction sometimes once the decision is made is that this is just horrible, it's awful, and it's not going to get any better. But giving it time, both as the player who has been deselected or the team that is deselecting, in time heals everything, or heals at least most things. There's not too many situations that I can think of where players eventually haven't come around to being able to communicate again and be acquaintances. If you were friends when you formed the team, or during the time you were teammates, and you were able to find a way to get along, then certainly over time it will probably run its course, and those bridges will start to be built again. But patience is often an important element here. And at the time, it probably feels like it's just the worst thing ever in many people's minds. But giving it time is an important piece. Empathy. Empathy can be a really powerful tool both for the sender and receiver of a message. So understanding where somebody's coming from when they're saying something to you, but also understanding what somebody is reacting to when they react back to you. So the person who's deselecting, or the athlete who's deselecting, or the coach who's deselecting, will be really careful to consider the perspective of the other individual. And then at the same time, the person who's maybe getting asked to leave a team, or the people that are being asked to leave a team, really important for them to consider where the others are coming from. So empathy can be a helpful tool to work through things, and can be really powerful on both sides of the equation. Pause maybe here for a moment for some comments.
Well, there's a good point here on the chat. One of the issues is the age of the team members. With the U15, U18, and U21 programs, ages of team members may be more closely aligned. That's an interesting.
So is that in comparison to
an adult team? So your pool of players is smaller? Is that what you mean, Dick?
We'll wait for his response, but in the meantime, I will jump back into this.
Yes.
So the other element here is when it comes to communicating and moving on through this in our own minds, how do we find the positive? And one tool that I would suggest can be really helpful is this idea of reframing. So reframing is about changing the perspective of a stressor. So changing how we see something. Being deselected from a team can initially seem like a really bad thing, a really undesirable thing. But we can start to kind of talk about it differently as an opportunity to play a new position, for a chance for me to grow, a chance for me to really work on other elements of my life, a chance for, any sort of positive reframing of what's just happened can be really helpful. And that can also come through the messaging of the sender of the deselection. And this kind of ties in with this last piece, which is this idea of perspective. So it's important for us to be able to step away from the situation and realize that this is just one blip on a sort of developmental radar of us as human beings and athletes. So while one decision might feel really heavy in the moment, it is often helpful to think about it as a setback, a roadblock, a detour, maybe even a shortcut, right? So having perspective and that it's only one piece of our lives and that we will move on and things will get better. So obviously, as coaches and parents, these elements, giving it time, having empathy, trying to reframe and sharing perspective, providing perspective, are tools that we can employ and utilize to help deselected players or players that did the deselecting through the follow-up. So these are kind of my sort of suggested themes here.
Aging out of the athletes, I would guess, is the major reason for the reformation of teams. Having these more defined age groupings might reduce the aging out from one age group to another.
Yeah, the possibility of sort of aging out together, I think, is what you're getting at here.
Yes.
But I do think, regardless, we're seeing players leave different provinces and play with players in different provinces, and when it comes to the availability of different players, sometimes you're playing with your teammate's younger brother who's 4 years younger than you, and in some cases somebody else moves into the neighborhood, and so definitely I would think the defined age groups would help with that, but doesn't mean that it's not going to happen the other way around.
Another comment, as a coach, you have to be aware of the emotions the team or individual may be spending so much time running away from.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to both what in the moment, like in the moments leading up to a deselection, but also following a deselection. So we want to make sure we're aware of how people are feeling and responding to one another and facing the concerns head on at the time, but also being aware of how people are responding once the decision is made.
Okay.
So,
all right.
Want to move into the second scenario?
Sure.
Okay, so the thought here was to talk about where and how. So I'm going to move on to the next slide of the Menti and ask that you join in and provide your thoughts here. So select the key considerations from today's presentation that apply to this situation. So I'm going to pull the scenario back up. And I don't know if it would help if I read it or just leave it up for people to consider.
Most everybody has it, so I think we're good.
Okay. So we obviously have a different age group of player here. There's an element of a player thinking about leaving a team as opposed to a player being deselected. So this is a kind of a reselection situation. And then we also have this added layer of some of the players on the team that this player is reselecting to aging out into playing adults, or not aging out, but deciding to play in a half and half adult and U21 schedule.
Yeah, I think people have been listening.
There you go. So we have a number of sort of votes here for in-person on the phone, and this is a situation where this could be, the individual has decided to communicate with all three of her team members in person or over the phone individually. So I wonder what the suggestion here would be here, and maybe this matters more to think about the individuals and how they would handle things than necessarily having a right answer in this moment. One suggested email here. So I'm interested to vote why the decision, or is that just we're applying the situation? So why would email be appropriate? Maybe there is a good reason, or a experience that somebody's had that would suggest that.
Well, I've had one experience with it, not directly, but helping a player process it after receiving it. I think we talked about it, Mick, about two very, very different communication styles, and the skip being a very direct communicator and the third being a processor, and the skip just put everything down and then press send. Yeah.
And not really spending some time to reflect. We have a comment here that our voice is being lost. And Len, there's been, I don't know if they can hear me or you can hear me, but there's been a question here about a specific team situation, and I don't think it's appropriate for us to comment on specific team decisions, especially since we're not directly involved with them. So I do thank you for your question, but I think we'll kind of move to discussing sort of more hypothetical situations.
Yep, agreed. Yep.
So I agreed, though, where in person and on the phone, probably the most appropriate decision in this situation. We do want to be mindful always of the rule of two. And then I think all four of those elements of giving it time, having empathy, reframing, and having perspective apply in this situation. So this could be all sort of helpful tools for Sue to employ and for her teammates to employ when they sort of get the news that she's deciding to leave the team. I hope these two situations have provided a bit of a picture of how different each of these different situations can be. No two team adjournments are exactly the same, and so the thought here is to be able to work through a series of sort of checklist items and think about them, and maybe add your own checklist or your own set of thoughts as to how you would approach them. And that's where that idea of starting to engage in your own personal reflection and your own sort of decision tree might be the most effective form of reflection.
And always communicating the way in a way that suits the style of the person who's receiving the message. Yeah. Trying to frame it so that it's in a method or a manner or a style that will be most able to be received by them, rather than just considering your own communication style, how you would like to communicate, but how the other person would like to receive it.
Of course, yes. And I think that comes down a little bit to that empathy. It's almost like a
yes.
prior empathy, thinking about how they would receive it and communicating in a way that would best suit them.
Yeah.
For some players, that's a short and sweet. I've decided to move on, and I think I just couldn't say no to this new opportunity. In other scenarios, it might be a very specific explanation that the person's looking for. So being ready for or equipped with both kind of approaches, depending on who it is something to consider.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hopefully all of these points haven't been like a real sort of dodging of the subject, and I hope we're kind of picking around the edges of some key considerations. I look forward to any comments on these two scenarios and these two elements here.
Well, I think the way you've presented it, Mick, has been very, very helpful because it gives people a chance. It gives people the chance to look at all of the information and then decide for their particular situation what order they're going to and how they're going to deliver the message, or do you know what I mean? So I think this has been very, very helpful. The decision tree hasn't been defined in this. These are the elements. It's up to you and your team as to how that tree is formed. So I think this has been really good.
So
Excellent.
Before we finish up, and I think we're getting close to that 2-hour time limit almost here, so I do want to share a couple additional resources, avenues to consider, places to look for more tools and more suggestions. So the first one here is the PYD Positive Youth Development SportNet. So that's a Twitter account where positive youth development coaches and researchers kind of post material. So on there we have an example of dealing with the cut. It's an infographic out of the University of Alberta. Some colleagues out of the University of Alberta put together some suggestions for how to work through deselection from the perspective of a coach or as athletes. So that can be found on that Twitter account. But I would definitely urge, if this is a subject matter that you're interested in as a coach or parent, to think about seeking some perspective there. I've also shared a link on an earlier slide relating to the emotional distress piece that can be clicked on in a hyperlink once this is shared. Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport, if a really difficult ethical situation comes up during the process of considering deselection, it is a place you can turn to. It's often thought of as a doping resource, but they also will help field or direct questions relating to ethics. Obviously, Safe Sport, relating to the idea of the Rule 2 and just making sure that we're being very careful around this emotional subject. Another resource to look into. And then on the sort of dealing with the aftermath or dealing with the consequences or dealing with the potential distress that decisions like this may cause, the Canadian Sports Psychology Association is a place you can go to find practitioners who are sort of experts in the area of sports psychology, and some have sort of more specific expertise. They're trained to help athletes through a number of different elements. And so going on there and clicking on the Find a Practitioner link, I believe it is, or Find a Consultant link, is a really good place to look for individuals in your area who can maybe help out. If somebody's really distressed or looking for significant help, the Canadian Centre for Mental Health in Sport is an online platform where psychologists who are trained to work with people who are in significant distress can be found, and they are regional. So if you're in a specific area and you're looking for somebody to help through, that will be a good place to look for resources. And then the Kids Help Phone, if the youth is involved, also a very good place to look. So it sounds like my voice has broken up again. But
I'm wondering if it's Chris's connection, because when Chris first came on the call, his voice was a little bit broken up. So I'm wondering if it's because he's kind of out in the boonies, I think, okay. Right, Chris? Sorry. So it might be his connection.
But hopefully this set of resources is a place for people to consider and look to, especially if you've had difficulty following this presentation today with all the different
challenges.
But I do appreciate everyone's patience on that regard. So definitely some good resources to look into.
Everybody is going to get the recording. So from our end, the recording has been clear, except for those times when Mick cut out. But I'm going to look into this further. This is the first time that we've had this kind of difficulty with a call in a very long time. So I'm quite disappointed. But anyway, I think Dolores summed it up perfectly here. Where is it? This has helped a great deal because we can now develop a process and be prepared for all possible outcomes. So it's been very, very informative, and I appreciate everybody's patience as we've worked through the technical difficulties. Hopefully I'll be able to figure out why this has happened, and we'll try to fix it. So Mick, thank you so much.
Okay.
for your work on this. It's been very informative, very helpful, and it's now a resource that we can all use. Are you okay if people contact you with any questions, etc., that they might have following this?
More than happy to hear from anyone and everyone with any comments, questions, feedback, thoughts. So if there's anything you wanted to follow up on or ask questions about, I'm more than happy to discuss them with you in any way, over the phone or via email. And I do want to also just thank you, Andrea, for inviting me to talk about this. And I hope everybody's managed to put up with the scrambledness of my explanations at different points here as we work through the situation. So
it's been great. It's been super. Thank you so much, Mick. So I'm going to stop the recording now. Let's just see what we've got. Okay, everybody stay safe, stay healthy. I'll just stop the recording. And